10 names, that is all that survives of 16 centuries. 10 names standing like stones across a river of time so wide that everything else, the languages spoken, the cities built, the wars fought, the griefs endured, has been swallowed by the current. Only the stones remain. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jarek, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, a father and a son 10 times over. It reads like an accountant's ledger, a name, a number, a death. And he died. The phrase appears so often in this record that it becomes a kind of drumbeat, a funeral bell tolling once for every generation. But listen closely to the silence between the names, because in that silence is hidden the oldest mystery in the human story, how a world that began in a garden, walking with its maker in the cool of the day, arrived, 10 generations later, at a single righteous man building a boat, because everyone else on earth had to be erased. This is the story of that decline, and of the 10 men who lived through it. Every genealogy has to begin somewhere, and this one begins with a sentence so strange that entire libraries have been written trying to unpack it. God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Not spoken into being as the stars were, not commanded as the sea creatures were, shaped like a potter's hands closing around clay. And then, breath. Something of the divine passed directly into the man, mouth to mouth, in a way granted to nothing else in the whole account of creation. The ancient rabbis who studied this text noticed the grammar itself was doubled. Breath of life is, in the Hebrew, plural in form. They took it as a hint. This creature was given not merely animal breath, but a nature layered, flesh bound to something that would outlast the flesh. Whatever the case, the man named Adam, a word that simply means of the earth, a pun the text never lets go of, becomes the hinge on which the rest of history turns. He is given a garden, he is given a task, to work it and to guard it, and he is given a single boundary in a world that otherwise has none, one tree untouched. I did not ask to be first. I only knew the ground was warm where I had lain, and that when I opened my eyes, there was a voice already speaking, as though it had been speaking to me before I existed at all. The boundary did not last. Extra-biblical tradition, the Book of Jubilees, composed centuries later by Jewish writers determined to fill in the gaps of Genesis, places the fall not on the day of creation, but years afterward, after the woman is formed from the man's side, after the two of them are given time to name the animals, tend the garden, and simply exist in unbroken company with their maker. Jubilees claims Adam and Eve were placed in Eden 40 days and 80 days respectively before they even entered it, a strange ritual detail reflecting a much later purity law read backward onto the first family. What matters for our purposes is simpler. The tradition insists the fall was not instantaneous. There was a season of innocence. It was real, and it was lost. Once the man and woman are driven from the garden, the biblical text does something unexpected. It does not follow them into exile with a chapter of lament. It gives us instead a birth announcement, and then, almost immediately, a murder. Cain is born first, then Abel. The text tells us Cain worked the ground, his father's old vocation, now under thorns and sweat instead of ease, while Abel kept sheep. Both bring offerings. One is regarded, one is not. And in the field, the first son born of woman becomes the first man to kill. This is the moment the genealogy of this documentary must make a choice, and it is worth being honest about that choice. Cain's line is fruitful. It produces Enoch, a different Enoch than the one we will meet later, and eventually Lamech, a man who boasts of his own violence in poetry, and Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain, the first herdsmen, musicians, and metalworkers. Civilization, in its first form, rises out of Cain's exile, but Genesis itself turns away from that line. After the murder, after Cain's descendants are catalogued, the text says simply, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and called his name Seth." The Hebrew name means appointed or granted. Eve's own words explain it. God has appointed for me another seed instead of Abel, because Cain slew him. It is Seth's line, not Cain's, that the Toledot, the generations formula that structures the whole book of Genesis, chooses to follow. This is the thread this documentary will trace. Not the line of invention and boast, but the quieter line of appointment and grief. I buried no son that day, because there was no body to bury, only a silence where a boy used to stand at the edge of the field. What is a father when he has outlived not just a child, but the very idea that death could be a stranger to his house? Adam, the text tells us, lived 930 years. Long enough, if the chronologies are taken at face value, to have known Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, and even to have overlapped by more than 2 centuries with Methuselah's own grandson. The first man could, in principle, have told the story of Eden with his own mouth to 9 generations of his own descendants. Whatever the historical reality behind these numbers, the theological claim is unmistakable. Memory of paradise was not lost to legend or myth within a generation. It was living testimony, passed hand to hand, for the length of the entire genealogy this film will trace. Where Cain's line names its children after tools, cities, and conquests, a city named for his son Enoch, descendants remembered for the bronze they forged and the songs they composed to their own strength. Seth's line begins with almost nothing recorded at all except a single sentence, tucked at the very end of chapter 4 of Genesis. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. 4 words in Hebrew and centuries of debate about what they mean. Some ancient interpreters read it as the dawn of formal worship, the first altars, the first prayers spoken aloud. Others, unsettlingly, read the same phrase as the moment idolatry began, men beginning to call by the name of the Lord, objects and images that did not deserve it, a corruption rather than a consecration. The documentary tradition this film follows leans toward the first reading, if only because it fits the pattern of what comes next. A line of men who are remembered for almost nothing except their names, their lifespans, and the bare fact that they had sons and daughters and then died. It is a genealogy of worship carried in silence, men who did not build cities or forge metal, but who, apparently, prayed. Seth's son is named Enosh, a word that does not mean man, in the strong, dignified sense that Adam does, but rather frail man, mortal, even sickly. It is the same root that gives later Hebrew poetry its most plaintive line in the Psalms, "What is man, Enosh, that you are mindful of him?" To name a child frailty is a strange act of honesty. It suggests that by the 3rd human generation, the weight of what had been lost in Eden was no longer an abstraction. Death was no longer something that had merely been threatened. It had a body count. Abel was dead. And now here is a child named for the very fact of human weakness, as though his parents looked at him in the cradle and, rather than pretending otherwise, named the truth plainly. My father told me of a garden he could still, apparently, describe by heart, the exact place a river split into 4, the particular scent of a fruit he never touched. I named my son for what I knew instead, that we would not return there, that we were, all of us now, frail things walking east of a gate we could not pass. And yet, immediately after naming his son Frailty, the text repeats its refrain. Men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Frailty and faith arrive in the same verse. This will become the pattern of the entire genealogy. Names that confess weakness, set beside a persistent thread of worship that refuses to be extinguished by that weakness. Here the biblical record becomes almost unbearably spare. Of Kenan, Enosh's son, we are told only that he lived 70 years and begot Mahalalel, then lived 840 years more, had other sons and daughters, and died. 910 years condensed into 2 verses. Extra-biblical tradition tries in places to fill the silence. The 2nd century BC Book of Jubilees, which reworks Genesis into a calendar of Jubilee cycles 49 years at a time, assigns Kenan a peculiar legend, that he discovered an inscription carved into rock by the generation before the flood, teaching astrology, and that he copied its contents in sin, hiding the knowledge from his own father. It is a small, uneasy story, and it exists for a reason. Even in a genealogy this thin, later readers could not resist searching for the first crack in the wall, the first sign of the corruption that will eventually justify a flood. Mahalalel's name, by contrast, is luminous, praise of God, or the shining one of God. Where Kenan was possibly compromised, his son is a name of pure worship. The 2 names sit side by side in the record, unexplained, unresolved, perhaps the point. Genealogies like this one do not moralize their names for us. They simply hand us the names and let us decide what pattern, if any, connects a father who may have stolen forbidden knowledge to a son whose very name is praise. Mahalalel's son is Jared, And here, for the first time since Cain, the genealogy hands us a name that unsettles rather than comforts. The Hebrew root yarad means simply to go down, to descend. Ancient Jewish tradition, reflected later in the pseudepigraphal Book of Enoch, read this name as prophetic rather than incidental. Jared was so named, some traditions claim, because it was in his days that the beings called Watchers descended from heaven to the earth. The Book of Enoch, not part of the Hebrew Bible, but influential enough to be quoted directly in the New Testament letter of Jude, describes these Watchers as a class of heavenly beings who, looking upon the daughters of men, lusted after them, and bound themselves by oath on a mountain called Hermon to descend and take wives. Whatever one makes of this tradition, and mainstream Jewish and Christian interpretation has always been divided about how literally to read it. Its placement in the chronology is significant. It arrives precisely at the midpoint of our genealogy, in the days of a man named Descent. This documentary does not require you to accept the Watcher tradition as historical fact, to notice what it is doing narratively. It marks the turn. Before Jared, the line of Seth is a slow accumulation of frail, worshipping men. After Jared, the world described in Genesis begins to fill, not gradually but suddenly, with violence. And the text itself, 2 genealogies later, will say the earth was filled with violence, and that all flesh had corrupted their way. They named me for a going down before I had gone anywhere at all. I have spent my whole long life wondering whether a name is a sentence passed on a man before his birth, or only a word his parents happened to choose. I raised a son. I called him Enoch, and in him at least something climbed instead of fell. Jared lives 962 years, longer than any man before him in the record, second only to his own great-grandson yet to come. And it is Jared's son who breaks the pattern of this genealogy more completely than any other name on the list. Every other man in this genealogy is described in the 5th chapter of Genesis with the same 4-part formula. He lived so many years, he begot a son, he lived so many years more, and he died. Enoch alone breaks the formula. The text says, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. No death is recorded, no burial, no years more and then. In a document built entirely from repetition, this is a rupture, and every ancient reader who encountered it felt the shock of it. Where did he go? What does it mean that a man walked with God, and why him, out of 10? The phrase walked with God appears only twice more in the entire Hebrew Bible before it vanishes from this exact usage. Once of Noah, later in this same genealogy, and once, much later, as an aspiration held out to the entire nation of Israel through the prophet Micah. It describes an intimacy of daily companionship, not a single mystical encounter. A man who apparently structured his whole life around an ongoing walk beside his Maker, the way another man might walk beside a friend down a familiar road day after day for 300 years. Because the biblical account of Enoch is so brief, 5 verses, no dialogue, no scene, later Jewish tradition rushed to fill the silence. And nowhere more elaborately than in the collection of texts scholars call Forn Enoch, portions of which likely date to the 3rd century BC, centuries before Christ, though the traditions they preserve may be far older. In this literature, Enoch is not a passive figure taken quietly from the earth. He is a visionary, taken on tours of the cosmos, shown the storehouses of the winds, the paths of the stars, and, most consequentially, commissioned to pronounce judgment on the very Watchers whose descent was hinted at in his father Jared's name. The fallen Watchers, according to this tradition, beg Enoch to intercede for them before God. He carries their plea, ascends, and returns with a verdict: there will be no mercy for what they have done. Their offspring, described as violent giants, sometimes called Nephilim, will bring devastation upon the earth, and a flood is coming to answer it. Whether or not one grants this literature scriptural authority, its function in the larger story this documentary tells is unmistakable. Enoch stands at the exact narrative center between the descent named in his father's generation and the flood that will fall 5 generations later, in the days of his own great-great-grandson. He is the hinge of the entire genealogy, the one man taken up, positioned precisely between the sin that provoked judgment and the judgment itself. I did not set out to see what I saw. I only kept walking, morning after morning, the way a man keeps walking a road because he cannot yet imagine where else his feet would go. And one morning, the road did not end where it always had. I do not have better words for it than that. I walked, and then I was not. Genesis tells us Enoch lived 365 years. Strikingly, the shortest lifespan of any man in this entire genealogy, a fraction of his neighbors' 8 and 9 centuries. Ancient commentators have not missed the number's resonance with the days of a solar year, though what to make of that resonance remains genuinely disputed. What is not disputed is the shape of the story. The man who walked most closely with God is also the man who stayed on earth the least amount of time. Presence with the divine, this genealogy seems to suggest, without ever stating it outright, is not measured in years. Enoch's son is named Methuselah, and of all the names in this genealogy, none has provoked more fascination because of what later scholars believe the name itself may mean. One proposed reading, built from the Hebrew roots muth, death, and shelach, to send forth, renders the name as something close to, when he dies, it shall be sent. If that reading holds, and it remains a matter of scholarly debate rather than settled fact, then Enoch, the one man in this genealogy granted direct access to divine revelation, named his own son after a coming judgment. The child's very name becomes a countdown clock, ticking through 969 years. Longer than any human lifespan recorded anywhere in Scripture, toward a day his father had already been shown. I named him for what I had seen, not because I wished it upon him, but because I could not unsee it myself. Every year my son lived past that was, in its own way, a mercy. A year the world was not yet finished, a year still left for someone, anyone, to turn back. Methuselah's life spans an almost incomprehensible stretch of the genealogy this film has been tracing. He is born while his great-great-grandfather Adam still lives. He will die. And Jewish chronological tradition places this death, calculated from the ages given in Genesis, in the very same year the flood begins. Rabbinic tradition seized on this coincidence and turned it into comfort rather than horror. God delayed judgment, the sages taught, out of respect for one righteous man's life. As long as Methuselah breathed, judgment waited. It is only once, when he dies, that the thing his own name promised is finally sent. 969 years is the longest human lifespan recorded in the entire Bible, and this genealogy hands that distinction not to a warrior, not to a king, not even to a man remembered for any particular deed, but to a name that functions almost entirely as a hinge between revelation and consequence. The grandfather who outlived nearly everyone, so that judgment itself might be, quite literally, held back by his living. Methuselah's son is Lamech, not to be confused with the boastful Lamech of Cain's line, generations earlier, who composed poetry celebrating his own violence. This Lamech, the 7th generation removed from Cain's line by contrast, and the 9th from Adam in Seth's, speaks only once in the entire genealogy, and what he says is not a boast but a plea. When his own son is born, Genesis records his words directly, one of only a handful of times any man in this entire chain speaks aloud in the text. This same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed. He names the child Noah, a name built from the Hebrew root meaning rest or comfort, the very word he uses to explain his hope for the boy. It is worth pausing on what Lamech is actually grieving. Generations after Adam, the curse on the ground, thorns, sweat, hard labor for daily bread, has not lessened. If anything, the text implies it has calcified into simple, exhausting normalcy. Lamech names his son out of the sheer weight of ordinary work, hoping, without knowing how, without any promise given to him directly, that this particular child might be the one to ease it. I have broken more ground than my father did, and my father broke more than his. Every year the thorns seem to know new ways to grow. When they set my son in my arms, I did not know what he would become. I only knew that I was tired, in the particular way a man is tired who has never once in his whole life known a day without labor. I named him for the hope that someone, someday, would not be. Lamech lives 777 years, a number ancient readers have long noted for its symbolic completeness, in deliberate contrast to the boastful Lamech of Cain's line, who in Genesis chapter 4 claims a vengeance of 70 and sevenfold. Where that Lamech multiplies violence, this Lamech's very lifespan seems arranged, in the text's own numerical logic, to answer it. But it is in the years of this Lamech and of his father Methuselah that Genesis tells us the world reaches its breaking point. Chapter 6 opens with the strange brief account of the sons of God and the daughters of men, of Nephilim upon the earth, of men whose fame is remembered, and then, immediately, the verdict. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The text does not soften this. It does not offer exceptions. It says every imagination, only evil continually. Whatever combination of factors, inherited violence from Cain's line, the influence the Enochic tradition assigns to the fallen watchers, or simply the accumulated weight of a world 8 generations deep in its own corruption, the world Lamech's generation inhabits has become, in the text's own stark language, unrecognizable from the garden where this genealogy began. I will not live to see whatever is coming. I feel it as a man feels rain before it falls, in the ache of old wounds and the strange quiet of animals. I have done what I could. I have named my son for rest. Whatever else happens, let that much be remembered of me. Lamech dies 5 years before the flood begins, according to the same chronological tradition that places Methuselah's death in the very year the waters come. 2 men, a father and a grandfather, both gone in the years immediately surrounding the judgment, neither of them will personally witness, as if the record itself is arranging its final generation to stand utterly alone. And so the genealogy that began with a man shaped from dust and given breath arrives. 10 names later, at Noah, the child named for rest, born into a world the text describes as filled with violence and corrupted beyond recognition. Genesis introduces him with a phrase that has occupied translators and theologians for millennia. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. The same rare phrase used of his great-grandfather Enoch, appearing now for only the 2nd time in the whole of Scripture. 2 men, 5 generations apart, are described in exactly the same words, standing on either side of the most consequential mystery in this genealogy. How one line, through 10 generations of decline, corruption, and mounting violence, preserved twice a man who walked, quite literally, beside his Maker. The phrase perfect in his generations has been read 2 ways by ancient interpreters, and the disagreement matters. Some read it as pure moral commendation. Noah was blameless compared to any generation at any time. Others, more cautiously, read it as relative. Noah was blameless only in comparison to the corruption surrounding him, a tall man among the sunken, rather than a man free of every flaw. Genesis itself, later after the flood, will show Noah drunk and exposed in his own tent, a detail this documentary need not dwell on, but one that later readers have long taken as evidence for the second, more modest reading. Noah was not sinless. He was simply, in a drowning world, still standing. The genealogy proper, the Toledot formula that has structured this entire film, closes with a final entry unlike any before it. Noah begets not one heir to carry a single thread forward, but 3 sons at once: Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the fathers, in later tradition, of every nation that will exist after the coming judgment. Where every generation before this one narrowed to a single line, Seth to Enosh to Kenan, and onward, this final generation opens outward into 3, as though the genealogy itself is bracing for what is about to happen. An entire world about to be reduced to 8 people, and then immediately expanded again into all the nations of the earth. It is here, at the very edge of the genealogy, this documentary set out to trace, from the dust of Adam to the birth of Noah's own sons, that Genesis pivots from the Toledot of humanity to the Toledot of Noah specifically, and begins the account most audiences already know: the corruption of the earth, the instruction to build an ark of gopher wood, the dimensions given down to the cubit, and the 7 days warning before the rain begins. They tell me I am the 10th. I did not choose to be born at the hinge of the world, any more than my great-great-grandfather chose to be taken from it before his time, or his own grandfather chose to be given a name that named the day he would die. I only know that when the instruction came, it came to me, not because I was without fault, but because, in a field gone entirely to thorns, one man was still, however imperfectly, listening. Look back now across the whole of the 10 names this documentary has traced. A father shaped from dust, who buried no son but lived to see 9 generations of his own descendants. A son named for appointment, who watched his own child be named for frailty. A frail man's line, calling on the name of the Lord in the very same breath that names its own mortality. 2 generations of near total silence, broken only by a name that means praise and a name that means descent. A man who walked with God so closely that death, when it came for everyone else, simply declined to come for him at all. A son named for the judgment his father had seen and could not unsee, who lived longer than any human being in the recorded history of Scripture, so that judgment itself might wait upon his life. A father who wept, in the one sentence the record grants him, for rest from a curse that would not lift. And at last, a builder, chosen not because the corruption around him had failed to touch him, but because in the specific and narrow sense the text insists upon, he had not yet let it finish the work. 10 men, 16 centuries by the genealogy's own count. A single sentence, 4 words, repeated and varied and threatened and finally answered. Men began to call on the name of the Lord. Whatever else was lost between the garden and the ark, the language spoken in Eden, the exact site of the 4 rivers, the faces of the men whose names now stand as 10 stones in a record otherwise swept away, that one thread did not break. It thinned. It nearly vanished more than once. But in a boat built by the 10th name on a list of 10, it survived the water that took everything else. The genealogy ends here, not because the story ends, but because the next chapter belongs to the flood itself and to the 8 who survived it. That is a different film for a different day. But the names remain in order exactly as they were given: Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, 10 stones across a river of 16 centuries. Still standing,